All right, everybody, let's get started. So, first of all, I just want to welcome everybody. Um, I'm super excited to talk about this. But why are you here? Well, obviously, you are a accounting firm that is curious about what all of these FTC guidelines and security best practices are all about. Maybe you're wondering, what do you need to do to comply with this? How does this impact you? Obviously you've come to the right place. So, um, in addition, you're probably wondering, well, what do I go, where do I go from here, even if I understand this stuff? And it's totally normal, right, to be unclear about how this impacts you and exactly what to do to protect yourself to avoid these penalties or lawsuits. So we're just going to get started and hop into this. I highly encourage you to be active, to be present, take notes. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you guys an opportunity to get some help from our team if you need something. So, who are we? Who am I? Well, again, my name is Ken Sakunim. I own North Star Technology Group, and our sole purpose is to help organizations protect reputations and information from bad guys. And we've been doing this for 23 years now. We started back in 2000, and today we really focus on cybersecurity protections, compliance regulations. So the FTC guidelines are right up our alley. I often present on cyber and compliance educational topics nationally, and so I think we are well positioned to talk about this topic. So, what are the regulations anyway? Well, the FTC regulations have actually been around for several years, but because cyber liability insurance claims are up, cybersecurity breaches are on the increase. All the attacks are happening a lot more. Accounting firms are in particular at risk, and so the Federal Trade Commission says, you know what, we need to put some safeguards in place. It's become too risky, and although this used to affect banks and some of the real money handlers, because CPA firms deal with sensitive information, this actually affects you. But Ken, I am a non-banking financial institution. Why should I care? Well, according to the actual safeguards rule, you are considered a banking institution, a non-banking institution, simply because you may complete customer income tax returns. So simply because of that particular function that you probably do, right, as an accounting firm, that qualifies you or puts you in the responsibility for meeting these expectations. And because tax preparation is considered a financial activity, you are required to do this. But Ken, what about this 5,000 record exemption? So a lot of people are hearing, well, if I only have under 5,000 records as part of my very small accounting practice, that this stuff just doesn't apply to me. And certainly that is true. But the problem is it only provides a partial exemption for some of the tasks, and we'll be going through all of these in a bit. But it actually only provides some exemption on how much you need to do as far as your risk assessment, which we'll talk about in a second, how much continuous monitoring you need to do with information and security, how much and how detailed an incident response plan you have to have, and what type of reports you have to put in place. So you still are responsible for at least half of the guidelines, if not all of them. So another question I get, Ken, is, are there any penalties, right, for non-compliance? Certainly, I'm not a lawyer, right? This is definitely not legal advice. However, it's also not a seatbelt either, right? So there are bigger implications, and we are starting to see fines and possible jail time for non-compliance. But at the very least, you want to be able to protect yourself from reputational damage. A cybersecurity breach could put your business out of practice for the sole focus that people do not want to work with organizations where they feel that their private information is at risk. So why should you listen to us? Well, I talked a little bit about how long we've been in cybersecurity, what our focus is, right? But the truth is, these cyber attacks happen every single day. Some examples of organizations that we worked with are local within our region. An engineering firm that we worked with was phished out of $300,000 after business email compromise. The accountant got an email from what she thought was the owner of the practice saying, hey, can you write a couple checks for 150 grand each? And she did that. A regional hospital that this just happened this past Halloween had a data breach that resulted in over 6 weeks of downtime happen over Halloween. They had an email server that was compromised and that was connected to the rest of their network, and ransomware was detonated across the entire network. The recovery time, even when they had the backup, was still a month and a half. Imagine how much business you could lose, especially during tax preparation time. Another example, regional data center that we worked with was hacked. They had a vulnerable external remote server that resulted in ransomware detonated across customer servers as well as their backup. And in this case, they ended up having to pay the ransom. The ransom alone was $150,000 just to get their data back. And that did include the at least $100,000 in forensics, cleanup, and communication and legal fees. Long story short, right? We are on the cutting edge of protecting organizations like yours from this stuff because we've done it, right? We've seen it, and of course during that process we've become a very, very integral partner with you guys to try to position yourself not only for protection but also for explosive growth. I got it. So how do I comply? So we're going to go through this. Typically, there are 9 different controls, right, that we need to put in place. Try to break this down to make it as easy as possible. But the first thing that you should do, right, as a CPA firm, right, that wants to comply with the FTC safeguards rule is to nominate someone within your firm, maybe it's yourself, as a responsible person, right, to manage this. And this person will implement and supervise the plan, have knowledge of where your data is and how it flows within your organization, and be that person, that point person that provides the reporting when asked. Step 2 is to perform a cybersecurity risk assessment. As you saw on a previous slide, this is potentially optional for organizations under 5,000 records, but I strongly recommend that you still move forward with going through a cybersecurity risk assessment. What this does is it helps you understand where your vulnerabilities are, where your risks are, and how expensive it could be if any of that stuff happens to get exploited. It's a process that we do every single week, every single month, right, with customers and prospects to help them understand their risk. Step 3, and I know that this is step 3, but there's eight things, right? But we highly recommend to be compliant with the safeguards rule that you implement cybersecurity controls. And these are a little bit technical, right? And so this is kind of where IT and kind of having that IT expertise kind of helps, right? Let's move my face. Control number 1 is access control, right? So this is the process, right, of determining who should have rights or permissions to see or modify a certain amount of data, right? And putting controls in place to prevent anybody else from being able to do those things. Number 2 is an inventory log, right? You want to know what assets you own, and this could be your workstations, your laptops, your servers, your phones, right? Your network infrastructure. Having a good understanding of the environment that you have allows us to be able to better protect it. Number 3 is encrypt your data. Encryption is essentially the process that we use, right, to take data that's viewable and make it unviewable except for the people that should be able to see that data. So in and of itself, encryption is good, right? When encryption is bad is when a bad guy encrypts your data, and that's usually part of a ransomware or malware attack. 4 is compliance, right? And then, of course, and that is if you have other regulatory issues that you need to deal with. But for us, of course, it's matching policy procedures, right, to the controls that we're putting in place. So we do some written document work for you. Multi-factor authentication is number 5. I'm sure you guys are very, very accustomed to this now. It's becoming commonplace. Nobody likes to do it, right? But it's required. Log into your bank system. I'm sure you're asked for a user ID and password as the first piece of authentication, and then some sort of code or token, or they send you a voice message or a text message, or you use an app, right? This is absolutely critical, providing 2 forms of ID, right, to get access to your data. Number 6 is getting rid of all your old stuff, right? And that could be part of a recurring process that you do when data gets to be a certain age. You archive it or you delete it. Most organizations that we work with have so much old data that it's just unnecessary anymore, that it's harder to control, harder to manage, takes more backup effort. Get rid of it. Number 7 and kind of number 8 really is to monitor access to the network, right? And again, this is technical stuff, right? So we use software to help you make sure that bad guys aren't doing stuff, right? That the good guys are doing what they're supposed to be doing and the bad guys aren't. And then again, finally, 8 is having a log or activity log of all of that action, right? And that's part of the audit process. So that's a lot for number 3, right? But these are things from a technical perspective that need to be put in place, and we need to have proof of we call it book of evidence that we're complying with these things. Number 4 is monitor and test your safeguards. Again, I'll move my face. We should be conducting annual penetration tests and conducting vulnerability scan assessments every 6 months. So many people confuse and don't know the difference between these two, right? So number 1 is conducting an annual penetration test. Well, a penetration test is where we have really, really smart technical people that try to break into your environment, right? So you have certain controls in place. You might have a firewall. You might have multi-factor authentication. You might have some sort of access controls that determine permissions, right? The process of doing a penetration test is to see if all that stuff is working, right? And if it's not, then corrective action can take place. Whereas a vulnerability assessment or vulnerability scan, right, is where we take a look at, usually through software, all of the inventory assets, right, that we said that you needed to gather and understand that you had, and we determine whether or not any of those things have some sort of vulnerability that could be exploited by a bad guy, right? So it could be maybe unpatched software, right? It could be unlocked doors where people could go in and steal a server or laptop, right? So we recommend having those done every 6 months and a penetration test done at least once a year. Number 5 is monitoring your vendors, right? So it's really, really important to treat your vendors that have external access to your data just like you do your employees, right? So we have a process we call it vendor risk assessment, vendor risk management, right? Where we work with organizations to manage the risk that they have for the use of their vendors and the customers that they provide external access to. And number 6 is to keep your security plan updated, right? Every time something changes, right? You might add a new employee, you might add a new piece of software, a new equipment. You should review all of this stuff, right? Is it part of your monitoring? Is it part of your backup, right? Does it introduce vulnerabilities, right, that you didn't have before? So this is not a one and done thing. Whenever change happens in your organization, you're introducing new risk or potentially new risk. You want to make sure you understand what that is, right, and deal with it. Number 7, incident response plans is a big one, right? Again, it's optional if you're under 5,000 records, but I don't know why the FTC would even make this optional. Essentially, this is a fire drill for your business. So what do you do if something happens? Like, what do you do if you have a cybersecurity breach? Who do you contact? Do you know the names and numbers of your cyber liability insurance provider? How do you get a hold of IT, if something happens? So an incident response plan, as I mentioned, is essentially a fire drill, right, for your business. And it's a step-by-step guide that says we do these things, right, in the event of a breach. And it is super, super important to build this before you have an incident, right, instead of trying to figure this stuff out when everything is on fire. We just had a webinar that we did with a business partner from Bowen Associates, Travis Kroger, where we talked about building incident response plans in conjunction and in context with your cyber liability insurance provider. We have access to that. I'll give you my contact information at the end if you want a copy of that sample incident response plan, as well as a recording that we did of that. But this is a super, super important step. And again, even if you're under 5,000 records, I highly recommend that you still have this plan in place. Number 8 is training your team. One of the biggest risks that we see and one of the highest attack vectors that we have for a cybersecurity incident is simply your employees. You could have all of the cyber controls and all the software and all the hardware in place, which is important. You have to have that. But at the end of the day, one of your employees could make a bad choice, right? Make a poor decision, click on something, download something, right? And put your entire organization and your data at risk. So the process of cybersecurity awareness training is to do just that, provide awareness and education to recognize risk and to avoid it. And finally, make sure that that designated person in step one, that responsible person should be able to report this information to a board of directors if you have that, or in the event of an audit or an assessment, be able to articulate how your organization is meeting these guidelines, right? The safeguards that the FTC has put in place. Essentially, it's building what we again call a book of evidence, right? Documentation, written report of the state of all of your controls. So how long does it take, all right, to implement these safeguards? Well, the reason why the FTC has extended the deadline to June 9th, right, and they've extended this a couple times, is because it takes a long time to get this stuff in place. So right now, in order to be essentially fully compliant, you're looking at still 4 to 6 months. And so it's so important to get going on this stuff sooner rather than later, right? And again, that extension from December was due to a shortage of cybersecurity professionals that can help and do these things. Get on top of it. Of course, Ken, that's all great, right? But what's the problem? Well, obviously, this stuff is time consuming. I mentioned it. The FTC had to extend the deadline because of lack of people that can do this stuff. It takes 4 to 6 months, even if you're doing all the right things. And that usually that timeline is because a qualified professional is doing it. It can take much, much longer if you're trying to stumble and get through this stuff yourself. Most internal IT teams, this is beyond the qualifications for, right? This requires very, very specific education and experience. And honestly, while you wait, you are still at risk. So what are your options? Well, of course, you could piece this stuff together yourself. Maybe you have an IT person, maybe you have a brother-in-law, right, that can help you with this stuff. But honestly, these things are very, very difficult to do. And at the end of the day, you want to make sure you have that book of evidence in the event that there is a breach, right, that you've done all of these steps properly. And obviously, your other option is to partner with a team like North Star, right, that can that does this, like we eat, breathe, drink it, we live this stuff, right? And we want to help you. So what's it like working with us? Obviously, we like to partner with the organizations that we work with. We are an extension, right, of your company. We have staff available 24/7, 365, right? So we're constantly working and helping your environment and protecting your environment. And obviously, we focus on top tier cybersecurity people, process, and tools. And honestly, I'd love to be able to help you. Check out my Calendly. I'm going to throw in the chat my email address as well. If you guys have any questions, right, or if you want to book a strategy session and talk more about this, check out my calendly.com. It's just my first dash last name slash 30 minutes. I'd love to talk to you. Any questions at all? I know that's a lot to get through, but I wanted to make sure we were able to end on time for you guys so you can get back to your lunches. Keep it open for just a little bit. So somebody said, hey, you mentioned needing a qualified individual. Yes. So I have a two-part question. I'd love to answer. First question is, how much time does that person need to devote, right? Well, the truth is this is a 4 to 6 month process if you are dedicating a lot of time to this, right? At a bare minimum, it's going to take up to 6 months, right, to become compliant, or at least to be able to provide enough evidence, right, to the Federal Trade Commission that you're doing what you're supposed to do. Um, of that, of course, most people do not have dedicated time, right, to focus on that. And that's where a partner like Northstar kind of comes into play. You essentially are allowing us to be an extension of your team and handle all this stuff for you. We do this stuff all day, every day. And so we're able to do this a lot faster than trying to figure this out yourself. Second question, is there a personal risk to someone taking on that role? Well, certainly, especially if this is an internal employee, right, for your firm, that person, obviously, even if it's their job, right, they're ultimately taking on that responsibility of making sure you guys have all the cybersecurity risk taken care of. That person, of course, is solely responsible then to account for their decisions in the event if there is a breach and they have to go through cyber liability insurance to get some sort of reimbursement, right, for this stuff. It's their name, right? It's their signature on all of those stuff. So I believe there's a lot of risk, right, that most internal IT people don't recognize or understand, and people that are not in IT don't realize the risk that they're taking on themselves, right, by trying to make this work. And we do a lot of work with cyber liability insurance providers, right, to make sure that we're checking all the boxes, right, and then we're preparing ourselves, right, for the event of renewals when that happens, or heaven forbid, we need to get a claim reimbursed, so we work really closely with that. And we don't focus just on the FTC compliance. We do a lot of stuff in healthcare, right, with HIPAA, which has its own set of standards and requirements, as well as CMMC for DoD contractors. Next question is, how would we prove to the FTC that we're doing all of these things? Yeah, I mean, so that's where the reporting process comes. So it's honestly steps 1 and 9, right, in my presentation. Step 1 is designating somebody that's responsible for this. That could be an internal person. It needs to be partly an internal person, but then that could also be a partner like Northstar. And then finally, that responsible person or party needs to be able to compose reports and documentation. We call it book of evidence, that shows that you've implemented those 9 safeguards. And we take care of all of that for you, right? So we build that documentation, and that documentation is constantly updated, because every time, again, there's change. You add a new employee, you add new software, you add new systems. You need to update that plan. And ultimately, it's a reporting process that you need to be able to provide auditors. Anything? Anybody have any other questions? Just gonna close out these. Okay, answered those. Anything else? We're almost to 12:30. Maybe we can finish exactly on time. Obviously, I appreciate everyone's participation and time. I know that this is a commitment, right, to educate yourself on these things. I know some of the stuff is kind of a pain. It's a hassle. It's inconvenient. I know none of you guys want to deal with this stuff. At the end of the day, you just want to provide services to your customers. And what I can say is that we can help you do that, take a lot of this burden off of your plate. I'd love for you to book a strategy session. But yeah. Okay, I guess there's one more question I'll hit here. Do we need to be a current full-time customer with you in order for you to help with this? No, you don't. So there's a couple different ways that you can work with our team. Obviously, if you could, schedule the strategy session, we can talk through the options. Part of it is to understand what do you have for IT resources currently, right? That we could augment, right, or assist with. But the assessment itself, right, can be done as a one-off, right, where we show you what things you don't have in place, right, to meet these safeguards. and then you could figure out a way to take care of them yourself. That's one way to work with us. The second way, of course, is we do that assessment, which is required, and then we provide an optional ongoing service, right, to get you to compliance and keep you compliant. And certainly that is a larger commitment, right, on your part as well as ours, right? But that's the way to most guarantee your success in this. Good question. Anything else? It's a really good question. All right, everybody, it is 12:30. I appreciate everybody's time. Hopefully this was useful. Again, email me, messages, my address is in the chat. Check out my Calendly, right, to book a strategy session. And I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, everybody have a good day. Thank you so much.